Hey, welcome to Mindset. This is a podcast that deals with faith and mental health. And my name is Ken White. I serve as the lead pastor at Forest Park Covenant Church. And I'm here with Becca and Jack Sisko, who are members of our church and also good friends, I'd have to say. Wouldn't you say? Yeah.
For sure. Of course.
I just wondered if you guys could tell us a little bit about your connection to Forest Park. Let's start that way.
Go ahead. We've been coming to Forest Park since 2011.
Okay.
So 13 years. We had a kid that just graduated from high school at that point in time, and the rest of our kids were middle school and high school, and we had heard many good things about the youth group here.
Oh.
We wanted them to be able to experience that, so we moved here at that point in time.
Yeah. Anything you want to add to that, Jack?
I think you covered it.
Yeah. Well, it's been great getting to know you guys. Jack and I have served on the lead team together, and we've done some things with men's ministry, and Beck and I have been working on a mental health ministry team together, and it's been great to see not only your leadership abilities, but also your openness to your own story. And so we'd been talking, and Becca had talked about her own working through some mental health challenges along with how that worked out in your family. So I just thought I would just start with that question. Why don't we start with the story of your working toward mental health?
Go ahead.
Well, pretty much I think everything kind of started after we had our youngest child, Renee, in 99. And we had several children close together, pretty much back to back. Kind of looking back now, we kind of see some of the things that led up to some issues that Becca had postpartum, where we just really she just kind of struggled through kind of getting back on her feet afterwards. And we didn't really know kind of what was going on. We just knew that there were just some things that were lingering. So we ended up after a period of time going and seeing our doctor, and found out that she was diagnosed with clinical depression. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Clinical depression, of which back at the time, just hearing that word kind of had a stigma to it.
Right.
And so we really struggled with that alone between the two of us for quite some time. Really not being able to share that with friends or family or in the church. It just had a stigma that was attached to it. And really that's kind of the beginning of how things kind of started off and our journey through it, which for a long time was just between the two of us and the Lord, kind of working through with really no instructions, no counsel, no guidance, no help at all from outside resources. So that's kind of the beginning.
Yeah. So not just clinical depression, but it's also kind of goes with what is oftentimes thought of as postpartum depression.
So what ended up happening is I had postpartum depression, but I didn't do anything about it. And so a lot of times when you have postpartum depression, you'll get through it. You can work through it. It lasts for a few months. There's different varyings of it. Mine did not go away and ended up turning into what they considered clinical depression. And basically what I was told is at the time, they did a scan of my brain, and what they told me was that my brain actually quit producing all the chemicals, all the important ones I needed to function. It quit producing, and it was causing some major mental issues as well as physical issues, and they were going hand in hand, and my body was not working. Yeah. They were not connecting at all.
Describe what you experienced with postpartum depression. Let's start there.
Okay. Postpartum depression, there's this thing called baby blues that almost every woman gets after they have a baby. Lasts about 2 weeks. You're in and out. It's just your hormones are going back to normal after the 9 months of being out of whack. Postpartum depression is when it lasts longer than that. It can be a postpartum anxiety. It can be a postpartum depression. And anxiety is more, you can see it more in like you're afraid to leave your baby. You're afraid to, for anybody, if you're afraid that everything's going to go wrong with your baby. That's more how that plays out. A depression is merely, basically, I didn't have energy. I didn't have, wasn't bonding that great. I was doing the work that needed to get done, but there was no emotion behind it.
Yeah. So how long would you say that lasted?
It was about 6 months when then Jack said, he's like, we need to go to the doctor because this is not just, you're not just bouncing back. You're not getting better.
There were some pretty major things going on. There's, were just unexplained falls. She would kind of just forget how to get home if she was out driving. There were just some things that really, they went kind of from a, normal things you might think of, you're just depressed and you're kind of feeling down and just kind of not like,
Motivated.
kind of motivated, to these really like dangerous types of things that were happening. And so at that point in time, again, the only resource that I really had or could think of was our family doctor. So we started there.
Yeah.
And so that was about 6 months, I think, after Renee.
Yep. And so then he was the one that diagnosed me and then sent me. He kind of, if I remember correctly, he wanted to like see how bad it was, wanted to see if the physical symptoms that were coming were in effect to that. Then they sent me for a brain scan, and that was when they found out that was basically my brain decided, in layman's terms, I've had too much. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm done.
Yeah.
So that was basically what my brain had decided to do. So then was making my body kind of follow.
Was Renee your fourth child or?
Sixth.
So she was your last child.
Mm-hmm.
So contrast your experience with having her with your experience with having the other five. Could you tell right away it was different, or you couldn't tell right away?
Yeah, I could. Her whole pregnancy and delivery were harder. I almost lost her a couple times during the pregnancy. And then her labor was 36 hours. They had to do a bunch of interventions while I was having her because things weren't going the way that they were supposed to go. So it really took its toll on my body. And looking back now, we can see, so the summer before I got pregnant for Renee, we almost lost two of our children. They both survived, but in two separate situations within 2 months of each other, we almost lost two of our children. And then one of them ended up with a major illness that, like, she was on an apnea machine, and I had to be like within arm's length away from her for 6 months. She was in the hospital every winter for the first 2 years of her life. And I just remember dealing with that summer, just praying, okay, God, please don't let me get pregnant. I can't get pregnant right now. Please, I can't handle it. I couldn't handle it after everything that we had gone through that summer. And lo and behold, the whole thing was just, it started on the wrong foot from the very beginning. And I didn't blame her. And I was excited after I found out she was pregnant and everything. I was excited. And then I had all those issues during the pregnancy. So then I started blaming myself that I had all those issues because I didn't want her in the first place. And so I think all of that played a huge part, and my brain just was done.
Yeah.
It was just done. And I took care of her, but it took me a little longer to and it's hard to explain because I loved her and I took care of her. I wanted the best for her, but it was everything I did was at an arm's length. I wasn't too close to anybody. I wasn't close to him. I lived in my own little world. Because I was going to ruin everybody else's if they knew how I really felt. And so I just stayed in my own head, which was not a good place to be because it wasn't functioning correctly.
Yeah.
So everybody was at an arm's length during that time period, not just Renee. But with her being a newborn up until, it took us 2 years to get me stable. So this was a 2-year process. So she was 2 years old before I was stable enough to function like a contributing human being.
Well, and during all that time, too, you're having to put up appearances, so to speak, in our life around us, in church, at school, at work, and everything else, because you can't express or really share with anybody what we're going through as a family. And so it was really within our 4 walls and mostly just between the two of us how we worked through this, because we tried to keep the kids, kind of out of what was going on, even though we all know how smart kids are and how much they perceive, what is really, really going on. But, that was one of the most difficult parts too, is that you're struggling with all of this internally, but we're having to act like we're not struggling with it whenever we're external.
Yeah. Did you notice almost immediately what Becca was going through, or did it take you a while to see it?
I think after a couple months, I started to really notice that there was something different here than in the past. But it's kind of like looking in the mirror every day. You don't really sometimes notice those incremental changes when they're so small until you kind of look back at a picture of yourself looking in the mirror from 6 months ago and you're like, wow, I really look old, or whatever the case may be. Not me, but you. I'm just kidding. But anyways, it's, you notice when you look back a lot of times. And in this particular case, that was absolutely it. It was really a couple key moments that, like the falling and some of those other things that were like, wow, okay. And then you start to look back and you start to see all these things that are progressively worse. And then that's the point where you're just like, okay, I need to just reach out for help at that point.
Yeah. Well, underlying us talking about this is for a person, if they're listening to it, who's maybe doesn't realize they're suffering from postpartum depression or a form of depression, to be able to hear it and understand. So one of the phrases you used is that your brain was done. And I wonder if you could describe that and what that felt like.
There was nothing going on. There was no love. There was no affection. There was no happy. There was no sad. There was absolutely nothing. If I woke up in the morning, I was going to say I was happy, but that wasn't even the case. I woke up in the morning and I was like, oh, I got to survive another day. And it literally was a survival.
Yeah. Do you think that condition is understood by people? Like, when you're inside of it, how would you contrast that with how you just might, like how you feel today?
No, I don't think unless you've been there, you have any idea what that's like. And I don't think that, even we've talked about this. He knew what it was like being married to me. He has no idea what it was like to live that and to deal with that every day. And he had his own stuff to deal with in that situation. But it literally was like I was a zombie.
Yeah.
And there was nothing going on.
Yeah. So you go to the doctor and they say this is clinical depression. This is plus 6 months after Renee is born.
Mm-hmm.
So describe, you said it took 2 years. So I'm understanding that it took another year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
So describe that next year and a half.
A living hell. That's the best way that I can describe it. We were having to work on medications, getting the right medications to put it in my system. It took that long to find the proper medication, and then after that, I was having to take it at the same time every day, because if I went a half hour without, because it was putting those chemicals that my brain wasn't producing into my brain. Well, they wear off after a time period. Mm-hmm. So if they wore off before I took them again, I would tank.
Yeah.
I would, for those first couple of years, just for some instances, our oldest son, and this is probably my biggest guilt that I'm trying to work through, because I know ultimately it was not my fault. My oldest son had to become an adult at 7, 8, 9 years old, because he was watching me constantly to make sure I was okay. Hmm. And Jack would have to call him during the day and say, "Mom, okay? What's Mom doing?" Because I don't know what I was doing. There were days I didn't get out of bed, and we just did what we could do in my bed. There were days that I drove as little as possible, because like Jack said, I would get messed up, not know where I was at, in an area that I've lived for a majority, for years. I wouldn't know where I was at. There was one time I was somewhere with the girls, and I was supposed to, our little thing was, anytime I went somewhere, I had to call them when I got there. And anytime I left that place, I had to call him on my way back. That was our way of, his way of keeping an eye on me, keeping track of me. There was one time I was gone for 2 hours. I was 15 minutes away, and I was gone for 2 hours. And I, to this day, don't know where I was at. And I had my daughters in the car with me.
I would say at first, when we went and with the medication, you got on the medication, and it was like a huge improvement pretty quickly. Like, it was noticeable, and so, being a man and being a problem solver and wanting to fix everything, you're thinking, okay, we did the right thing. We got her to the doctor. We got her the help that she needed. We're on our way. And, that was just short-lived as, we went through the process of tweaking medications and different things. And, really that was just the beginning of the entire journey. It was a good first step. I mean, we needed to do it. It was necessary. I mean, it was life-saving. But really that kind of just started quite the trip of many different changes. And I think, at that point, looking back, that kind of triggered for me, looking at her as more of one of my children instead of my wife. It wasn't intentional, but as she said, I had to so many times check in on her and make sure she's okay and where's she at and what is she doing, that, I stopped partnering with her to a large degree in our family. So, I mean, it was a tough thing from different perspectives for both of us. But one thing we did do is we did keep pretty good open communication about how things were going and how she was feeling. As much as, looking back now, it's super simple for us to, kind of share, like, what's going on? What are your thoughts? What are you thinking about? But back then it was, this was a really taboo thing and something we didn't know how to navigate. But looking back, the Lord certainly just kept his arms around us through this whole process as we navigated something we had no idea what we were doing.
Yeah.
So
There were times, and as it distances itself, we've become more open about things that we kept inside for fear of hurting the other person, just because of the fact that we were going through enough as it was for us not to hurt the other person with things that we're thinking. So there's been a few things since then that we've discussed, that just the fact that God kept his arm around us in numerous different levels. But there were times where he would tell me, and I didn't know this at the time, but that he would actually leave our bedroom because he couldn't bear the thought of waking up and me being dead.
Oh.
So he would sleep in the room with the kids just because and there were many times that, and I know we've talked about suicide and suicide prevention. I had a plan because of the fact that there was just so much guilt around the fact that I wasn't taking care of my family properly. I wasn't loving them properly. I wasn't loving Jack properly. Their life would be easier if they weren't having to deal with me or take care of me or,
which is completely false, right?
It is.
it was.
It is.
Yeah, because there was literally zero resentment from me through this entire time. Like, it changed our roles, and it changed, kind of how the things I had to do, like I said, with kind of viewing her as like one of the kids to some degree, with having to monitor and make sure she's okay. But it was never really a feeling of like, oh, why am I doing this? Or I shouldn't have to be doing this. I mean, we had our fair share of frustration more from me of like, I can't fix this. And I wanted to fix it. And so that was where the frustration for me came, was like, I can't make it better. And so we just had to keep moving from day to day. And a lot of time in prayer, a lot of time just, just searching.
There were times where that I would, and I still to this day don't know. I've since been diagnosed with PTSD, so they didn't discover that at the time, but they think that is a factor in where a lot of the physical side effects were coming from, because and so they have now figured it probably was both of them at the same time.
Yeah. So a post-traumatic stress. So the trauma was coming from?
That's a whole nother story. There was a lot of different traumas that had been built up over the time, but probably the closest one to that was dealing with almost losing a couple of the kids, and then the extent of the difficultness of that pregnancy.
Yeah.
But my body would just go limp, and my eyes would be open, and I would be awake, and I could hear him talking to me, but I couldn't talk. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. So he would literally lay me on the couch, and sit on the floor and hold my hand until it came back. And we never knew when it would come back. And the first couple of times it happened, I remember him calling the doctor and it's like, help, what do I do? And he's like, it'll come back. And
what is it? Your consciousness?
The being able to talk, being able to move, and it would. I don't even remember how long it would take, but we just would sit there and he would hold my hand while I was unable to.
Yeah.
Like I said, I was awake and I was looking around and I knew he was there.
Yeah.
But I couldn't talk. I couldn't move. I couldn't.
You've mentioned a couple of times that the medications were sort of helping to regulate the chemical balances. Mm-hmm. So what was depleted? Did they describe that to you?
So my brain was not producing any serotonin, and it was not producing any. I'm pretty sure it was dopamine. I'm trying to remember. There was another one.
Serotonin and dopamine.
Yes, I think those. I know serotonin was one of them for sure. I know your brain. I'm pretty sure your brain produces 3, if I can remember correctly. And there were it wasn't producing any of them, but there was 2 that they were concentrating on. So I was taking 2 different pills every day, basically one for the one and one for the other.
Yeah. And so this is about a year and a half of adjusting those medications. Is that?
Yes.
So in terms of talking about that time frame, you're putting the time frame at plus 2 years or year and a half on medication. So describe when, I guess, it started to change, and what did that feel like, and how would you describe that?
I think they just got, with all the tweaking, I think we just found out exactly what my brain needed. And so it got to a point where I still had very little emotion, which I know can also be a side effect of that medicine. So sometimes the side effects can kind of mimic the actual problem. But I was able to get up, and I was able to get the kids breakfast and get them off to school, and get them to make that connection with them, to enjoy being at their games, to enjoy being, I was able to live life like a normal person. I still had I still had side effects. I didn't cry for like 20 years. Not a single tear, because they just didn't happen.
Well, and initially at that point, when things were stabilized, you would think, oh, okay, everything's great now. But that was pretty much that was all triage up until that point. And now you're at a point where we're now dealing with not only what brought her to that place, but then everything that happened over those 2 years. And then also just now the battle of knowing that you're living with this and the side effects from those medications. Yeah. So it took away the initial piece, but it presented a whole nother level of challenges, not to mention the fact of 2 years worth of new habits, 2 years worth of new routines, 2 years worth of things that we've established to a point where
to survive.
Yeah. Now you're having to rework all of that again.
Are the medications something that are ongoing then, or did you taper off, or how did that work?
I was on them for 20 years.
Okay.
We knew that there was a chance that it would never go away. We knew that it could go away, and if it did go away, it probably would come back. So for 20 years, with yearly checks in with my doctor, same doctor that helped us from the very beginning, I'd go in and we'd talk about it. And then we started working on some things internally, some things that we needed to deal with, some things that, some of those traumas from the past, we just started working on them individually and together and with God. And as I started letting some of that go, and some of that, I don't know, I just felt like just such a weight off my shoulders. Yeah. And so we sat down with our doctor, and we were like, okay, it's been 20 years. I am not the same person that I was. I've been stable, but I'm not the same person that I was. What would it look like if I try to go off and try to be without them?
So what did it look like? Because you said you tapered off.
It did. And ironically enough, it was in 2020 when the rest of the world was going on them. I was coming off of them. Yeah. It took a long time. It was 6 months to a year.
Yeah, that's about right.
It took us to wean off of them.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because by that time, Renee, who had only known me as that mom, because even though I was living life, that still wasn't me. Jack jokes about the fact that he's been married to 3 different women in his life. Me as an 18-year-old when we first got married, me being sick, and then now me now.
Yeah.
So the being sick was not my personality. It was not me. That it changed my personality. But that was all Renee had ever known. So I actually think the kids adjusting to me being me, after all of that, becoming the woman that God has brought me to be, was more difficult than adjusting to going off the meds.
It almost feels like a newlywed game question, but could you both describe Becca before and Becca after? Becca
before and after, let's see.
Are they the same? They're not the same.
I would even say that's not the same. I mean, Becca's always been a very strong, independent, stand up for herself, question, challenge back type of person, not in a negative way.
Don't take it that way.
But very strong. During this time, just became very much, I don't want to say a doormat, but just a doormat.
During the
time, especially, and I think this is some of it what she's alluding to with Renee, is that they just always saw her as someone who struggled for all that time, and maybe even, they may not ever say this, but maybe even weak to some perspective. Inside all along, I never looked at her as weak, because I knew what she was going through, and I knew who she really was. Afterwards, she is even stronger. I think it's probably just that I recognize more who she is, and appreciate more who she is, and value more who she is. But I think, I've heard people say this when they go through tough times. This is my perspective, and I don't want to say, oh, I wish you would go through it again. But oftentimes when we go through tough times in our life and then we look back, we see how God works, and we say, it sounds weird, but I'm really thankful for what I went through, because look at what you made me to be today, and how you grew me through those situations. And so, I mean, our relationship, our marriage, our family has never been stronger since we went through that.
Yeah. So, Becca, how would you just heard what Jack said, but how would you describe that before person and during and after?
So the before person, I did not feel like I could truly be me. I was raised in a super conservative where women have their place. I did not fit that role. I tried, because that's what I was supposed to do, but I did not fit in that box of what I was told my entire life that I was supposed to be. So there was an internal battle on what I wanted to be, how I wanted to be, versus what I was told to be. And even that within itself was made to be a bad thing, because that was the sin coming out. The fact that I was struggling with being in that box was the sin coming out in me, which may play a part in that whole middle section, because I did not feel I could be true to myself. Now, probably in the last 5 years, I feel like I am who God made me to be. And it has taken me 50 years to get there. But I feel that I am living exactly into what God created for me.
Yeah. So how would you describe yourself now in kind of human terms?
I am very independent. I don't like help, and that might be from having so many years of feeling like I was helpless. I don't like to ask for help. I can do it myself. I have emotions. I cry, even at the most randomest things, which I'm like, after 20 years of not having emotions, just to have the random tears come up, I guess they're not necessarily a bad thing. I'm, this is very cliche, but I don't know, I feel like I'm living my best life. I feel like I love my family. I get to be a part of their lives. I don't know. It's hard to describe myself.
Yeah. Well, let me just ask one last question. There's more that we could probably say, but if you were to say to somebody who is wondering if they're working through postpartum depression, both for the person and for the spouse, what would you advise them or say to them?
Get help. I was told at that point in time that I should probably go see a therapist. And that was the stigma around seeing a therapist back then was ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so I put it off for way too long. Get help, ask for help. And one of the reasons I do my job that I do now is ask me for help. I've been there. I'll sit there. I will hold your hand. I'll do whatever you need. Just don't feel alone.
What is it that you do?
I work for Catholic Charities. I work in healthy families.
Okay. How about you, Jack?
I think from my perspective, it's so different if I was giving advice back then versus now, because we thought we were the only ones going through this. In fact, we didn't even know what this was that we were going through. There is not near the same or even any stigma around what we went through. If this were to happen today, we wouldn't have waited 6 months. We would have had friends and family that would have been a support system to us. We would have known more. Would have been a ton more resources. But just in general, it's a tough perspective to be at. From my perspective, to look at your spouse and then say, basically, I think something's wrong with you, or I think you're struggling with something. Especially when someone's struggling with something, that may be the last thing they want to hear. My advice would not to be pull them aside and say, I think you're struggling with something. We need to fix you. We need to figure that. I think the bathing in prayer and the really just navigating that with a very intentional, sensitive, spirit. But you have to be willing to just kind of look and see and identify, we all go through changes, we all go through struggles, but when you have to just not wait too long to let something become, bigger than what it started as. So not be afraid to have the conversations, but also you need to do that in a way that's not critical, it's not judgmental, it's not, confrontational.
Yeah. I think what we'll try to do is we'll just add some links to some resources that people can see. We'll ask you guys for some of those ideas and put them at the end of this podcast. And there's always the opportunity for people to see somebody that will help them. Talking with somebody is always really important. We've been in this journey with our church of creating a mental health ministry. I've had that experience of working that through with another church, and it's very, very helpful for people. One of the things that I think that we're trying to do, there's 3 things. One is to destigmatize mental health challenges and to educate people. And then also the third one is to try to give people help where they might be able to go. And I think I especially really appreciate you talking, because on destigmatizing any other kind of illness, any other kind of ailment with our body, we would talk openly about if we're going to have this kind of procedure or that kind of procedure. But for some reason, I think that people are under the impression that they should be able to just talk their way out of something and, pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And, when we talk about you having a depletion of dopamine and serotonin, I don't know who can produce that just by talking to themselves. Mm-hmm. So there are people who have various experiences with counseling, and one thing didn't work and this other thing worked, and then their belief is that this worked, and so it works for everybody. And that also is unfortunately not true. And so, there's all those kinds of things that we're really trying to work through. But appreciate you. I wonder if you have a last word that you'd like to share with our audience. Nothing about the Lions. Yeah.
No, just
I think just with that and, other issues that we've gone through, through those 20 plus years or so, I think have given us a different perspective on life in general and on the things that are important, taking advantage of the health that we have when we have it and doing the things that we love to do, specifically together during the time that we do have. So I think that's just kind of one of those things that helps with that.
weirdly enough, I had a heart attack at 43 years old that they could not find a cause for. I mean, obviously, I had blockage, therefore the heart attack, but they couldn't find, no idea why. No high cholesterol, no high blood pressure, nowhere in my family history. And there's talk, there's now proof, but there's talk that all of that other stuff could have just hindered my body. And
Yeah.
so my body just, after fighting all of that for all of those years, and that they're somehow connected.
Yeah.
There's no proof on that, but there are some people out there that feel that way.
Yeah. Well, again, appreciate you sharing that. I mean, being able to share what you've struggled with, and then also just sharing about some of the physical possible ramifications of that's very helpful. Glad to talk with you today, and really glad that we're in fellowship together. So thanks.
Thank you.